Gentlemen, welcome to the beginning of the first session of the afternoon. I hope you are all nourished intellectually as well as in your stomachs and ready for what should be a very interesting set of conversations this afternoon, and then, of course, another breakout session at the end of the day. My name is Ely Ratner. I'm the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at CNAS. And what we're going to do over the next 50 minutes or so is talk about, in my view, an incredibly important issue in the world, which is the potential separation of the US and Chinese economies. A phrase that you're hearing a lot around Washington now is decoupling to describe this process. And to be specific, what we're talking about here, which is the potential reversal of decades of deepening economic interdependence between the United States and China, and instead a relative reduction in trade and investment flows, the rerouting of supply chains, and less integrated research and innovation ecosystems. Now, when I and others started talking about the potential for this phenomenon about a year ago, the reaction was, that's never going to happen. That the US and Chinese economies are so interdependent that decoupling may be a fantasy of strategists, but is not going to be a reality. But I think what we're seeing today is some degree of partial reality is in fact happening. And despite protestations from different quarters, facts are occurring on the ground, and some of which are potentially irreversible. And I think that'll be a question for the panelists today as to whether we can put the genie back in the bottle or not. So what we're here to do today is talk about the question of not if this is going to happen or not, but rather why is it happening? How far should it go? And what are the broader economic and geopolitical consequences of increasing or, say, decreasing economic interdependence between the United States and China? To help us sort through all that, we have gathered an absolute all-star crew here today. To my immediate left, Tom Donilon, who should be well known to everyone in the hall here. If not, you probably should be up in the Hospital Association conference on level 3. Tom has held many jobs in government, including as the National Security Advisor in the White House, and is currently the chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute. Welcome, Tom. Next to him, Liz Rosenberg, the director of the Energy and Economics program at CNAS, which has been working on coercive economic policies and 21st century tools of economic statecraft for years now. I think one of the most innovative and interesting research programs in all of Washington, and has a depth of experience on these issues. And then to her left, finding himself on the left flank today. I guess you're right. They're right. That's right. So to your far right, Derek Scissors, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, also someone who has devoted his career to these issues, not just picking them up over the last couple months. I have a trusty iPad here. I asked for questions over Twitter throughout the week, and I will be raising some of those from friends of the CNAS community. Rather than me asking questions and then turning to audience questions, I'm going to be integrating them throughout the session. So as with the morning, if you have questions, please tweet them to hashtag CNAS 2019. You can use the conference app to ask questions, or there are CNAS staff collecting note cards as well, and I'll be receiving these all as we discuss here. Okay, let's jump in here. So, Tom, why don't you start us off with the big picture here? So you've obviously been in the cockpit of this relationship almost like no other over the last decade. Explain to us, why are we at this inflection point now where the United States and China are considering taking steps to walk away from each other?
Thanks, Eli. It's great to be here today, to be with you and my former colleague Liz, and with Derek. I'm glad we got the right positioning here for you, make you comfortable. And I also, Eli, I was happy to hear you say that we're not going to debate whether decoupling of some sort in some sectors is happening, because it is. And we're in the course of our progressive, I think, decoupling in some technology areas right now, but also some strategic decoupling too, which we can talk about. So how did we get here at this moment? I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about that. First is, I think it's fair to say that the U.S.-China relationship is undergoing the most significant change it's undergone since the opening of China to the global economy and the establishment of formal relations in the late 1970s. I put that proposition recently to members of leadership in China, you didn't get a lot of pushback on it. This is a really significant moment in U.S.-China relations, unlike anything that we've seen really in the last 40 years. Second is I think we'll look back on 2018 and see it, I think, with the lens of history as the year in which U.S. policy towards China really underwent a fundamental change. You wrote about this with Kurt Campbell in the spring issue last year of Foreign Affairs, and I think I think you can describe this shift, and it's certainly not original with me, and I think it'll turn out to have been correct, as a move from a United States approach of strategic cooperation, which has its roots in Richard Nixon's first trip to China in February 1972, to a strategic a relationship or an attitude of strategic competition, and in many cases, in some sectors, intense rivalry. Third, the tensions that we're experiencing right now are not just limited to economics. I think that they're structural. They include tensions and competitive aspects in the military area, the geopolitical area, and in the ideological area, frankly, which doesn't get as much attention, I think, as it's going to get going forward here. You know, the shift has been broad, and it's been supported in the United States quite broadly. It's bipartisan. I think it is embedded in a number of institutions in our country at this point. It's in both branches of government, the executive branch and the congressional branch. It's deeply embedded, I think, in the business community now and in the NGO community. So it's a broad-based shift, I think, that's been underway. Bottom line is, I think that we're in a new era of Chinese-U.S. relations, U.S.-China relations. The contours of this relationship, the rules of the road, as we go forward here, are not clear at this point, and I think they're being developed. One, I think, a deficit we have among many right now is I don't know that we have real strategic dialogue underway with the Chinese at this point. A trade negotiation is not a strategic dialogue. A trade negotiation is quite a specific thing that we have underway here, and we really don't have the kind of strategic dialogue which we will need in order to manage this new era of U.S.-China relations and to get in place the kind of the rules of the road going forward. Just to finish up initially here, why did this happen at this point? Which is your question. There are a number of reasons for this. Some of this are natural and predicted, frankly. That as China rose and came up against the dominant global power, the United States, there were bound to be areas of tension that would develop. Some of it is rooted, I think, in the approach that President Xi has taken, both domestically and internationally, which has been different from his successors. There's a debate about that, I know, as to whether or not there's kind of continuity with Hu Jintao or a sharp break. But at any rate, the acts themselves are different in kind, I think. Third, I think, is there's been a sense that the United States has kind of provided a vacuum here. I think in some ways faster than the Chinese expected, frankly. And last, I think that the story we told ourselves about how this was going to go, that as China became wealthier, it would move towards liberal democracy and its political outlook, turned out not to be true. Again, if you talk to Chinese leaders about that, they'll say, "Well, who told you that?" Right? But it is nonetheless a fact, I think, that there really was a set of assumptions that undergirded the U.S. approach, and there's been a change, I think, to date. Technology is driving a lot of this right now. Trade gets the headlines, but I think it's not the main game ultimately. I think the main game ultimately is technological competition between the United States and China in all its aspects. We've seen the merging in a number of cases of security and economic issues, which make these especially difficult issues. The Huawei example, I think, is manifest in that. And last, I think I'd say that, again, we're focused on the trade negotiations, and there may be a meeting, obviously, between President Trump and President Xi at the G20 on the margins of the G20 meeting at the end of June, although I don't know if that meeting's formally put together at this point, and it would be difficult to imagine any sort of comprehensive resolution of the trade issues there. But even if, this goes to your opening point, even if some sort of partial deal, set of understandings, reduction in tensions, sort of truce is reached on the trade issues, this is not the dynamics that have been set in motion right now will continue. And so I think that we are in for an extended period of a change in U.S.-China relations, an extended period of trying to work through these tensions. And the last thing I'd say is it's also an important question for us to ask is whether this reflects a broader decoupling in the world between different types of governance systems, which maybe we can talk about, which would be more state-centric authoritarian systems on the one hand, and the liberal democracies on the other hand. A lot of, I think, differences, obviously, and they're becoming more manifest and more difficult kind of in running things. So I think that you're right. We have, for all these reasons, I think, we're at the front end here, kind of a progressive decoupling. And trying to manage that and what it means is going to be a real challenge on both sides.
Terrific. That's a perfect segue to Derek. I got a question from a friend of the CNAS show, Nazneen Barma, professor out at the Naval Postgraduate School this week, asking a simple question, which is, we're seeing these trends that Tom described. Is this a deliberate strategy? Is decoupling a deliberate strategy inside the White House, or are these secondary effects of other pursuits? Now, I'm guessing your answer is going to be it depends who you ask, but maybe you can help pick apart inside the administration as best you understand it. What are the differing views in terms of the goals and desired endpoints of decoupling? Is this leverage for a deal? Is this a technology competition? Are we looking at containment? How do you read the different views here?
I should start by saying I'm one of the original advocates for partial decoupling, so you all should know that I'm biased. Let's just make that clear from the beginning. And I think I have a very good read of the Trump administration today. So over the weekend, I'm no longer responsible for anything I say right now. There are people who are advocates of decoupling in the administration. In my experience, they are primarily in the national security community. What they want to emphasize, it varies, but it's usually focused on technology, as the two of you have already said. I'm not in the national security community. I don't know everything they think. I have not heard people talk about containment. I've heard, maybe that's an ultimate goal, but the current goal is we need to stop supporting Chinese military improvements directly and indirectly, and that requires a form of decoupling. There's a group in the Trump administration that I think is correctly associated with Secretary Mnuchin, which is basically, of course we want more from the Chinese. Yeah, we always want more, but 2016 was actually fine. And if it's not worth a major confrontation to upset the benefits that we get from U.S.-China relations. And you can see that when, in early 2018, when Secretary Mnuchin came back from Beijing and said the tariff war is on hold and we have a deal, which was clearly not true, but he wanted it to be true. And then finally, I think the crucial part of this is the president is closer to Secretary Mnuchin's camp than he is to the decoupling camp. Now, some people might say, I don't think you're right. Let me try to quickly say why that's the case. The president primarily wants more U.S. exports to China. That's coupling. His interest in national security and IP is secondary to that. It's secondary to that throughout his career. It's secondary to that in his campaign. It's secondary to that when we started the negotiations. So he definitely wants a different relationship, but he doesn't want a decoupled relationship. He wants a bigger relationship with more, first-order U.S. economic gains. The twist is, of course, if he doesn't get those, the president will push us down the road to decoupling, not because he's thinking of it necessarily in a strategic sense. He's thinking, I want to make a deal with you. If you're a bad partner, I'm walking. And then we end up with the decoupling that may be planned in other parts of the administration, but is not the president's primary intent.
Can I ask Derek a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So that's interesting. So the president clearly is, as you said, most focused on the trade aspects of this and the eliminating the trade deficit and having more opportunity for American business in China. That would not be the goal of a decoupler, right? The decoupler's goal would not be to make investment more attractive in China. And as you said, if the no deal is gotten, then a lot of the stuff that's in place in the bureaucracy is going to roll forward. Let me ask you the opposite question, though. If a trade deal is achieved, right? Am I wrong about the statement I made earlier that the dynamics and the governments on both sides are going to roll forward regardless of that? Or do you see a President Trump who would step in and affirmatively stand in front of a lot of this bureaucratic forward motion right now in the decoupling or more confrontational things? You know what I mean by that?
I think that's a very good question. And I would say maybe you're conditionally wrong. You're definitely not wrong. The conditional be, in other words, the Chinese are complaining because the president keeps asking for the same amount of purchases, even though the time window for the purchases is shrinking because we haven't made a deal. He's not going to give in on his major issues. So when you say we have a deal, And then does that keep the bureaucracy from rolling forward on pushing for decoupling, which I agree, that's the initial dynamic. My answer is, how satisfied is the president with the deal? Is he satisfied when he makes the deal? Yes, or he wouldn't make it. Is he satisfied a year later in the middle of a campaign? Is he satisfied a year after he wins re-election, or it doesn't matter anymore because he'll be gone? I think the way I would put it is, the president will step in and interfere with the bureaucracy. He's done it already, repeatedly, if he's really happy with how things are going. But that's a vulnerable state to be in. I think I can safely say keeping President Trump happy does not seem to be an easy thing to do. And so the bureaucracy is not going to stop pushing for what they want. And you'd have to rely on a president who's very happy with the U.S.-China relationship, not just when the deal starts, but 3 years later.
And I want to bring, I want to bring Liz here.
Right.
I want to answer
Say what you will, but I want to ask you a question that you can build on, because that's all and well. There are also a set of policies here: export controls, investment restrictions, even putting aside the entities list and Huawei, which are almost for sure going to continue. Right, and these are having all sorts of secondary effects. Liz, this is something you've watched very closely in the sanctions world. So talk to us a little bit about, as someone who thinks not just in lofty strategic terms, but thinks of these as policies with regulations and departments and agencies, and what are we talking about here? What are going to be the effects here? Walk us through some of the unanticipated challenges and effects of these trends.
Right, so thank you for that.
And then whatever else you want to jump in.
Right, actually it works well for what I wanted to say here, which is, yes, it's possible, and we should have the conversation about the degree to which the president and the White House may interfere, not interfere, but set specific guidance for the way in which, as we're saying, the bureaucracy can roll forward or not. But there's no ability for the president to shut it all down without a very advanced directive that goes at a whole array of policy, regulatory, law enforcement, diplomacy, research exchange, visas, currency. I mean, there's a huge array of policy instruments that are in play and that are pushing us towards a kind of decoupling across many different areas of funds flows and goods movements. So even if we have the president saying, as he has gotten involved in particular instances of enforcement, think about the ZTE cases or the Huawei cases, there are many other areas where I think even if there is a pause on some of that, there will be a movement forward. And that will, as it already has, conditioned a sense of risk amongst investors and manufacturers, other people who trade in commodities, who are thinking, regardless of, and perhaps particularly because we don't know how the president will behave in his sentiment in a scenario of a deal or not a deal, the caution is causing manufacturers to move operations outside of China already or set the plans in motion to do so, thinking about creating separate and redundant supply chains, R&D activities to try and insulate themselves for a scenario of risk or one in which particular technology controls or trade controls or sanctions or currency controls or energy flow controls on the flow of energy and other resources do have the effect of accelerating this disaggregation or decoupling, which, by the way, won't just be bilateral. It will certainly compel the rest of the world to make choices. So we're talking about clubs of trade, right?
Just a small point. I agree with that entirely. So there's no disagreement. I would just say we're talking here about the scope of decoupling. I can imagine very easily, and I'm not going to name the candidates, but I'm sure many of you can imagine who they are as well, a second-term Trump administration with a comparatively pro-China Secretary of Defense and a comparatively pro-China National Security Advisor, which would not be the one that we have now. And in that situation, the president doesn't have to constantly intervene. He has people in place who do that intervention for him. We have one at Treasury. We can have one at other departments. So I agree with the uncertainty, and I am not saying this is this is likely. I'm saying if the president's happy with the deal, you're going to get people in charge of these departments who are going to limit the actions that Tom and Liz are talking about.
And so, Tom, of course, this takes two to tango here, and one could argue decoupling is the result of years of Chinese policy, not something Donald Trump invented a couple of years ago. Setting that debate aside, I know you interact with senior Chinese officials. I ask you a question. Number one, sort of what does this look like from their perspective? And number two, maybe for the whole group, if plan A is get the president to make this all go away at the G20. If that doesn't work, what's plan B? But first, what are you hearing from counterparts in Beijing?
I don't think Plan A is going to happen. And I do, just to
please.
underscore Liz's points here, we have in place now and Director, right, the enforcement intensity will vary by the personnel, but we have in place a substantial set of both inward bound and outward bound regimes, right, focused on the U.S.-China relation at this point, and it's had big impacts in the world already. If you look at the IMF report, World Bank, the International Energy Agency yesterday, all pointing to reduced global growth as a result of the trade disputes, not just the direct effects, by the way, but the sentiment effects, right? And the confidence effects in the world. And you would, in the world I live in right now, you would find a lot of people working very, very hard to understand these inward bound, outward bound kind of dynamics, and winners and losers both by company, sector, and nations, as Liz said, going forward. So the scale of this is massive in the world right now. On the Chinese side, I don't sit in the the Politburo Standing Committee, obviously in China, but you can observe a number of things, right? The public nature of the dispute, the public nature of calling off the negotiations and then moving to increased tariffs and then the threat of additional tariffs on 100% of Chinese imports into the United States makes this a much more difficult problem.
The language from, I'll let you continue, but the language I think from Larry Kudlow yesterday again saying, if Xi Jinping won't meet with the president at the G20, then here come the escalation of tariffs. Very public, puts them in a tough spot.
It's very public, and it does makes compromise more difficult. Compromise is always more difficult in a private negotiation than it is in this kind of very public back and forth. Secondly, it's become much more complicated, frankly, by the steps with respect to Huawei. We had a trade negotiation, a trade dispute underway, and now we have an action taken. And there's a lot. We can spend a whole session on Huawei and the security aspects of it, the competitive aspects of it, the conduct aspects of it with respect to the company. But it's a very important company, obviously. In China, the largest telecommunications company in China, the largest producer of smartphones in the world, even more than Apple at this point. And there's going to be permanent impact with respect to Huawei here. And you have to ask the question, is it possible to get some sort of broad deal on the trade issues without having some sort of resolution on Huawei, which is a much more difficult thing to see forward, given that, as I said earlier, you do have this combination of economic and commerce issues with technology and security issues. So difficult this become more difficult moving forward. I think the Chinese obviously see this as a substantial move against them. The Huawei steps. My own judgment is that it won't end with Huawei with respect to entity designations. That there are any number of issues in the United States which are being raised right now, including issues around surveillance companies in China and whether or not there should be steps taken with respect to those companies. There are issues being raised about all manner of cooperation that we have right now. We've had a model, for example, on artificial intelligence, which has been really very collaborative, quite open source at this point, and collaborative back and forth. I think there's going to be pressure on that model. So it's a difficult problem becoming even more difficult. The observations on the Chinese side, obviously, are increased nationalism, a fairly pervasive and intense propaganda effort at this point. The themes of that are preparation for a long encounter, a long struggle to go forward here. Discussion of a range of retaliatory steps, which you would expect in a trade battle like this, that there would be retaliatory steps on the other side. A number being considered. We can go through the Liz would have a better list, better graph on the list than I would, but nonetheless, a discussion I think is fair about the options on retaliation. There's been real damage, I think, on both sides in trust, which again will make this more difficult going forward. A big theme I think you'll see on the Chinese side, and I think in the conversations that our companies, U.S. companies, are having with our government are around what's the impact of a determined Chinese effort towards more self-sufficiency, particularly in core technologies on which they rely, like semiconductors. And what does that look like 3 years and 5 years and 10 years from now in terms of the impact on the United States companies? So and I think struggling with where does this end up strategically. And of course, there'll be all kinds of, there'll be all kinds of questions about how they'll have the same conversation. How did we get to this place, and how do we move forward, and at what pace should we move forward? So those, I think, some of the observations, Eli.
Great. No, that's terrific.
On the Chinese
yeah.
side.
And so, Derek, one of the things one hears talking to some folks in the administration is Chinese have more to lose this than we do. That this is going to hurt them more than it's going to hurt us. When you think about a sort of escalating tariff war, some degree, not full decoupling, some degree of partial decoupling. One, is that right? It's going to hurt them more than it's going to hurt us. Is it going to hurt us a lot or not? Talk about the relative economic costs for the United States and China through these processes.
Okay, I'll try to keep this brief. Obviously, that's a very comprehensive question. The short answer is never get in a fight with a reserve currency country. You cannot win against the reserve currency country. You can't. So if we're willing to use the leverage, different question, we have the leverage. Let me give you two specific examples. On the Chinese side, people are talking about employment. China is a contracting labor force. There's not an immediate employment problem. But what there is a problem with their foreign exchange. Chinese foreign exchange reserves in the last 5 years have dropped $900 billion, still the largest in the world, but the trend is negative. That's while they ran a $1.5 trillion goods and trade surplus with the United States. When the Chinese say we want to have balanced trade with the United States, they're lying. They can't afford to have balanced trade with the United States. They can't afford to have anything close to balanced trade with the United States. If they did, we wouldn't be talking about 7 to the renminbi, we'd be talking about 9 to the renminbi. There'd be no BRI. BRI is funded by American consumers. If you're not a balance of payments person, they get hard currency by selling to us. They are bleeding hard currency. Without us and the enormous trade surplus they run with us, they don't have the money for their international operations, diplomatic, military.
No replacement market.
No, and 5 years ago, China was running a net capital surplus. Now there's nothing that can replace the U.S. They run a surplus with the EU. It's smaller than ours, but because you're running a deficit, you can't handle the loss of hard currency provided by American consumers. On the flip side, on the American side, and again, I'm taking a slice of the relationship because you don't have time for me to talk about the whole thing as much as I'd like to. Excuse me, Liz. The flip side, if we apply 25% tariffs across the board to all Chinese imports using the 2006-18 level, that would account for about 1/7 of the increment to GDP in 2018. So we'd lose about 1/7 of our GDP growth. And that's a one-time shock. Whatever our GDP growth is going forward is not hit by this. That's an exaggeration because we would be able to substitute to other suppliers. Now, if we also apply a 25% tariff to Mexico and then go down the list, we obviously increase the shock to the United States. But if we just focus on China, as some of us...
Which is not an immaterial point.
Right, no, it is, right. There's an important risk in U.S. policy. If this is just attack everyone we run a trade deficit with, we get a much bigger effect. Not just directly, but because we want to substitute from China to other countries, not attack the other countries we're substituting to. So, we get a one-time trade shock that we can make pretty small if we choose the right policies. They get the loss of an irreplaceable market. There are other factors. There's long-term efficiency factors you'd have to weigh against whether we're better protecting IP. It's very complicated, but the initial first-order economic effect is they need our money much more than we need anything we get from China.
Elizabeth, reflections on this, reflections on sort of private sector response on the economic piece of this. How are companies responding? The Chinese, what are you seeing here?
Chinese companies or U.S.
Either
companies?
one. What are you seeing as the most interesting piece?
It's not a zero-sum game unless you come away with what Derek said and think like, oh, well, as I think a number of policymakers or analysts do and say they have more to lose than we do, so it's time for us to roll up our sleeves and get serious because we have withstood IP theft and trade secrets theft and espionage for too long. We haven't done anything about it. We certainly haven't adapted our export and our export controls, our inbound investment restrictions, other national emergency authorities to deal with this. So we're playing catch up now. So one thing that I want people who come away from the scenario you've just described thinking, all right, well, it may be painful and we may sustain some losses, but we looking forward, we are going to soldier through this, and in order to catch up and in order to, and live with some of this decoupling in order to advance our national security interests and to be able to cease giving away for free this intellectual property and trade secrets.
And it's now or never, I would aim. That's part of that narrative as well, that if we don't do it now, one, the U.S. economy is strong, and before China's economic power is greater, we're not going to have this opportunity again. So there's an urgency to the moment in what you're describing.
So
is that narrative as well?
Yes, I agree. So one thing I don't want people to come away from and say like, okay, we're ready to, we're going to take out the hammers and we're going to play defense and we're going to push back. What we should not forget is that all of these pushback tools they have limited utility, and they are secondary for sure to our primary goal, or they're limited utility if we do not focus on our primary goal, which is make sure that our economy is very strong, and we need to focus on the base. So right now, our policy, it's a lot of tactics, it's light on strategy, and we are under-focusing on, or under-attending to issue area number one, which is making sure that our greatest comparative advantages, our greatest economic strengths remain strong and remain superior, so that we have the basis with which to use these various economic instruments we have with effect, and also to compete aggressively with China and the rest of the world. So that means doing things like research, investing intensively in research, regulatory sandboxes to make sure that entrepreneurs and developers stay in the United States instead of go elsewhere, thinking about standards and best practices, and making sure that we, to the greatest extent possible, work with friendly countries, other advanced economies, to have parallelism on investment restrictions, on joint ventures, on a common approach to state-owned enterprises, making sure that we use rules of the road to our advantage here. So don't come away with this story, from this story, and think, well, we're going to lose less and we're overdue, time to course correct and not focus simultaneously and maybe even more on developing the strongest U.S. economic advantages.
So Tom, I want to turn to you in just a second, because I know you've been thinking about this a lot, and I wanted you to talk about, from Liz's affirmative agenda, sort of what would you add to it. But I do want to go to Derek quickly as sort of a fresh perspective on sort of the allied question in all of this, because it's not as simple as we need to work with our allies. As you hear, the allies have different interests, different views, but play that out a little bit for us.
Let me just make one quick point of agreement with Liz, something she didn't say, but and it's very unpopular in Washington. I might be the only person in the room who still thinks this. Remember I said that you don't fight with the reserve currency? Irresponsible fiscal and monetary policy undermines the status of the dollar or the reserve currency.
Right.
We are undermining our biggest advantage, our insuperable advantage over China and anyone else we want to take on in an economic fight. We are undermining it. So I don't want to put words in Liz's mouth, but to the spirit of her, get your own policies right. You're okay with that in this case? In this case, I want to put words in Liz's mouth. In the spirit of fix your own house is absolutely correct, and monetary and fiscal policy are what give us the way to win an economic conflict with China.
One more sentence about what that means in your view.
I have a number for you, and this definitely would be putting words in Liz's mouth, so this is just me. In the 2018 budget, science, space, technology, education, training, this is White House figures on spending by superfunction, $127 billion. Medicare, income security, Social Security, $2.1 trillion. That's not investing in the future. It may be investing in a political victory, it may be investing in the past, it's not investing in the future. We can't be running a budget for transfer payments and maintain the dollar as global standard. I know no one wants to talk about this, but as a China person, I get to not think about getting reelected or anything, and that is a crucial pair of numbers to compare. With regard to the allies, I'll try to keep this really short. All I want from people saying work with our allies is an understanding that not only do our allies have different interests than us, so sometimes we will not be able to work with our allies, they have different interests than each other. East Asia, our East Asian allies, even if they have huge economic relationship with China like Australia, they are very keenly aware of security and political threats from the Chinese. When you talk to the Europeans, it basically seems to come down with the Germans like, I don't want them to take over our robotics industry. And everything else is secondary. So it is not, you can't just say, I want to work with our allies. You have to say, on this issue, which is a priority for me, these are the allies I can work with. These are other allies. I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to punish them, but we're not going to be able to come to a consensus in any sort of timely fashion. So all I'm asking for on the ally side is tell us what your priorities are and tell us the allies you think we can work with, because work with our allies that's not a strategy either.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
I'd be happy to answer that question. A couple of things. One is just on the private sector, just over 10 seconds on this.
Yep.
This is a huge focus of the private sector in the United States and around the world right now. And it is the general uncertainty which we've talked about. It's a supply chain disruption that Liz mentioned. Some of this was underway anyway in China because of increased labor costs, but it's accelerated and it's become much more uncertain. I think companies have moved from contingency planning to action at this point because they don't see kind of an end to the uncertainty. There's a lot of concern about collaboration and really what's the future of my collaboration with China. There's deep concern in the tech community about where to go here, and there's a general concern about the question presented is the United States going to continue to be the leader of the global trading system? And if the United States isn't the leader of the global trading system, what does that mean in terms of fraying of the system, bad actions of the systems, and ultimately deglobalization? First point. Second is, Derek, I agree with you on the balance analysis, balance of payments analysis and current accounts analysis. That does mean that China's going to need a lot of capital coming from the externally, including from the United States going forward. Third, there was an alternative strategy here, is an alternative strategy here, and it does go to allies, right? And the alternative strategy involved a mix of, we had a set of allies and partners who agreed to an approach and a high standards trade agreement in Asia called the TPP, which was available. It's now gone forward with 11 countries without the United States. It's actually put U.S. companies at a disadvantage, frankly, with some of our closest friends. There are opportunities, I think, to agree on kind of common approaches among allies more generally on things. Moving forward, so there was an alternative, I think. And by the way, there's also the alternative on the reciprocal issues of continuing and successfully negotiating a BIT treaty with China, which were all put to the side in favor of the approach we're taking now.
Now, to be fair, the Chinese were slow rolling.
They were.
The BIT, while the Obama administration was putting forward a pretty good faith offer at the end of the term.
I think that's fair, but we did finish the TPP. Didn't get it completely.
Yep.
Obviously, weren't able to implement it. President Trump withdrew from the TPP on his first day in office. But there were alternative approaches here. Now, you could argue about how effective they might have been and how long it took us, but there were alternatives. On Liz's point, which I think really is the mega point here, obviously, we have a real interest in addressing Chinese conduct and its treatment of foreign companies. We have a real interest in reciprocity issues, and these are the things that are on the table for the United States. But it really is, at the end of the day, much more about us. You can push on these things, and you can get. Remember, we're talking here about some kind of fundamental issues around Chinese approach to development. You can make progress, and it would be good for the United States. It would be good for the world to make progress on some of these things, and I hope we can succeed on this. But at the end of the day, Liz's point is exactly right. It is really about us. It sounds cliche-ish, but I think it actually captures the question right now is, why isn't this a Sputnik moment in the United States? Fareed Zakaria did a column a week ago where he said this was a Sputnik moment in China. I actually think that's a little late. I think the Sputnik moment in China has been in front of them for a while now with the realization that, in fact, that their technology companies really were quite intermingled with the United States core technologies. And I think that the self-sufficiency themes we've been following kind of Xi Jinping's rhetoric and the policies of China has been front and center for a while right now. We just did a $2 trillion tax cut in 2017 and really had no conversation about this investment agenda that Liz talked about that includes innovation, it includes R&D. In 1964, 1963, our R&D, federal R&D, right, and Derek gave the numbers right now, was 2% of GDP. It's about 0.7% of GDP right now. Why isn't the United States at 2% of GDP? I actually think that if you had a discussion, I see Michelle Flournoy here, she may disagree with me or not. I think if you had a discussion with the leaders of the Defense Department, they'd be willing to contribute to this on the civilian side. An infrastructure project, I think people will look back on it today and say, how could it possibly be that a country with the great needs that we have, with money at interest rates lower than the predicted rate of growth, right? So it's essentially kind of a guaranteed deal. How you didn't have an infrastructure investment project underway of a substantial nature in this country, historians will look back and really not understand this. And I think also on the disruptive technology side, we should be leading on the adaptive strategies for technology and the change in the job and labor markets. We should have a sensible immigration policy. So there's a long list of things. I think if you got key Republican and key Democratic economists in a room, it would take about an hour to come up with a set of things that would actually put us in a much better position to compete over the long term, which I think are actually much more important than a lot of the things that we're talking about. And one little thing we should do, by the way, is get Congress involved and reestablish the Office of Technology Assessment. If you see Congress engaged in these technology discussions right now, I mean, technology will be at the center of most of the foreign policy and national security issues we have going forward, and not to have kind of the highest quality technical help in Congress with an organization that was eliminated in 1996, I think they cost like $3 million a year when it was eliminated, is really a shame. So I think Liz is exactly right in terms of strategy. A trade negotiation is not a strategy. And all of kind of effort, national effort is a strategy. Last thing I'll say is, remember on Sputnik, people kind of say, well, it's kind of ancestral worship, you know, and you're old. That's true, right? You know, but you're looking back on these guys with a halo on them. But think about this. Following up on Sputnik in the late 1950s, early 1960s, we had the National Defense Education Act, which fundamentally changed the way we taught science and physics in the United States. We created DARPA, we created NASA, right? And we had substantial increases at R&D. And essentially, we as a country are still living off a lot of what we invested as a result of that incident. So sorry to go on.
No, terrific.
I think Liz is exactly right.
I think that's important stuff, and we're running out of time. So I just want to ask Liz and Derek, from a policy perspective, what are sort of the new tools, new areas that you're focused on if we're heading down this road? There are talks about, we heard this morning, discussion between Senator Murphy and Senator Hawley, talking about U.S. industrial policy, which is something you never would have heard in Washington even 5 years ago. Liz, you've been running a whole set of research projects at CNAS thinking about how to deal with economic coercion for American companies that are having to respond to being blacklisted themselves, being pressured in various ways. So as we think about the U.S. economic toolkit, in addition to the investing in science technology, but from an economic policy perspective, I get the macro points, but on this specific issue, where do you see the real opportunities and demand for innovation on the U.S. government side? Liz, why don't you start?
Yeah, so I am going to reach back to the conversation a little bit
Yep.
and say, so there ought to be three buckets to this agenda, and in no particular order. The first one is get the facts on the table, get them in public. Let's talk about this not in ideology or in grand strategy, but let's talk about a lot of facts here. So this is awareness raising, transparency, disclosure, heavy emphasis on disclosure. We are underperforming on disclosure, including where there are ties for foreign influence to universities, to local governments, to public institutions, that sort of thing. And also with respect to foreign companies in the United States where there are inadequate audit requirements for them and inadequate requirements for the disclosure of beneficial ownership information. We don't even know who some of these corporate players are in the United States. That's not merely a China issue, that is a broader issue. So that's the one, get the information out there. A second one is the pushback, and this is these coercive economic policies. We spent a good amount of time already talking about trade measures, trade remedies, tariffs, but also the restrictions or conditionality we put on export of particular technologies, restrictions on inbound investment, restrictions on banking or financial flows, also commonly known as sanctions, currency restrictions, and on other goods. And part of the pushback here is definitely work with I won't say allies, but other, and it doesn't have to be in a particular multilateral framework. We will be doing well if we are drawing on multiple different multilateral arrangements, whether bespoke for this purpose or extant. So thinking about the G7 or other, for example, to think about the setting rules of the road. And the last one, which I had pointed out before, of course, and that we've talked about, is the affirmative agenda and doubling down on U.S. growth. And we've covered a number of those areas for research, immigration, education, not just immigration, but also visas and people flow. We definitely don't want to stop smart people from everywhere in the world, including China, to come to the United States and study here and create value and capital here and have that stay here as well, in addition to investment dollars, which we want to come and be active in our markets, create capital in our markets, whether it's from China or anywhere else. The color of that money is good. That has to be a priority. So to the extent that we are using that group of coercive economic tools, it cannot sever. We have to be very careful to make sure it does not sever the flow of funds we want, even in a world where there is quite a lot of disaggregation or decoupling.
I'm shocked at the idea that I get the last word here. I feel like filibustering for 10 minutes to
Well,
make
you
sure.
haven't had the last word yet.
I know, that's what I thought. I agree with the first thing Liz said for sure, and I would want to put a point on it. We don't enforce our laws with regard to China. We don't enforce our laws with regard to beneficiaries of IP theft. I know that because there are firms that we could sanction that we're not sanctioning. We don't enforce our laws with regard to disclosure. We don't enforce our laws with regard to anti-competitive practices. With a smaller country, this really wouldn't matter to our economy. China's big enough now that it does matter. We don't protect the firms that are most harmed by Chinese predatory behavior because we don't enforce our laws. And if I had more time, I'd start giving you lots of examples of this. So there's an easy thing to do here. It doesn't require spending money. It doesn't require anything other than taking our own laws seriously with regard to the Chinese instead of making them subject to diplomatic review or political review otherwise. With regard to industrial policy, obviously a big question. As a conservative, I am extremely suspicious of industrial policy because you start off with a good goal, a goal you should follow, and you end up who knows where because there's political capture. And even if you do the right thing for 2 years, it's not the right thing after 2 years because the economy moves very quickly and now you're doing the wrong thing. What I would like, and I'm not in the national security community, so I'm inviting them to tell people like me what to do, is the national security community to look and say, where in technology, as Tom has correctly said, the heart of this, where is our long-term technological competition going to occur with the Chinese? On a national security basis, not on the do a million other things basis, not on the, like, look, I have a trick that we're going to use for national security and it's going to cause tons of economic growth. I don't believe any of those claims. Tell me in the national security community where you are worried about our technological competition with the Chinese. That's where federal government research and federal government intervention is justified. That's, if you want to call that industrial policy, I'm okay with it. But I don't mean that we start saying, hey, we have all these economic policies and trust me, they'll help on China. I want much more specific guidance than that.
So I'm going to start with a prioritization effort, right, that you've just called for here and call out in particular high technology. We've had the opportunity in the conference today to talk about a number of areas in this domain, as well as financial services, two areas where we still have a competitive advantage. We have sophisticated actors, and we should do everything we can to make sure those remain at the forefront.
Okay. Tom does get the last word.
Okay.
Fire away. Yeah.
You know we weren't going. I just two quick things, right?
Yep.
One is that it is important for us, I think, as a country to have, you call it with industrial policy or a set of national priorities, and identify those critical technologies to our safety and security going forward, and then ask the question about what should we be doing for those. It's not. We do have tremendous levels of investment in our private sector in the United States in technology. It's not the same thing, frankly, and it's going to be, but by its nature, aimed to returns on investment for the private company. There's a difference, right, going forward here. Second is, the history is actually not bad on this, right? Some of it's not predictable. You have spillover effects from kind of basic R&D investments that aren't predictable, and they take a long time to happen. But our history has been, since World War II, it's really worth doing this. An adjunct to that is we need to bring science back to the center of policymaking. One of the things I really regret that I didn't get done as National Security Advisor was to have inside the National Security Council a deputy National Security Advisor and an assistant to the President for technology policy to make sure we had that voice at the table every single day. Because I said earlier, Eli, most of the national security problems you face now have a technology aspect. The last thing I'll say is I also think it's a comprehensive China strategy. It's not just for this panel. It is really important for us to find our voice and values as an organizing principle for us going forward. We have a tremendous amount of strength in this that we're not taking advantage of. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'll say from a CNAS institutional perspective, I think from you, as you hear from this conversation, this is why Liz's economics program, Paul Shari's technology program sit astride our defense program in terms of how we think about national security and American competitiveness. These things we don't think as separate, but absolutely together and need to be integrated. And that's much of what we're doing at CNAS, trying to think about how all these things interrelate rather than treating them as entirely separate domains. So please join me in thanking Tom and Liz and Derek for a terrific conversation.
Thank you, Ray.